All right, class, welcome to this PowerPoint on terrestrial biomes. We're going to be looking at all of the biomes that we need to know for AP Environmental Science and that you guys may be tested or quizzed on. This is the same learning objective that we were looking at for the previous terrestrial biomes PowerPoint. The main thing that we're going to be looking at here is this bit of essential knowledge for all of the different types of biomes. So this is going to be a relatively long PowerPoint that is looking at just one small piece of essential knowledge. But like I said, you guys need to know all these biomes, and we're going to look at the major biomes around the world, which include most of the ones that you see on this map. Now, this one does include some that we are not going to talk about, and some of the ones that we will talk about can be broken down into different subtypes, but we're not going to worry about those too much. We're just going to stick with the ones that I have listed. And we're going to be looking at this map throughout the entire PowerPoint. So I'm going to show where we are each time that we return to this map through the different biomes. I also want you guys to keep an eye on the net primary productivity for each of the biomes. And you guys should know in general which biomes have high primary productivity, which ones are getting to that kind of medium or low primary productivity. You don't need to know specifically which ones have more than others per unit area or by total NPP, but you guys do need to know in general if it's high, medium, or low. And if you didn't get it on the vocab slide, this is the list of the biomes that we're going to be looking at. Basically, as you go from the equator to the poles, it goes in this order. I'm not going to read them all to you, but the only exception to that are the riparian systems, which can be anywhere. I just put it down at the bottom because they're a little bit different than all the other ones. What's also kind of cool is that if you're at the equator and you increase in altitude, you can also go through many of these biomes. So Ecuador is a really fascinating country and a really biodiverse country. And one of the reasons for that is because you can start at sea level at a tropical rainforest and then go up the Andes Mountains through deciduous forests and then montane forests and then the alpine tundra and then ice and snow where they actually have glaciers right at the equator. So increasing altitude and increasing latitude will bring you through these different biomes. And we're going to start at the equator with tropical rainforests. Tropical rainforests, as the name suggests, have heavy rainfall either consistently all year or most of the time they're going to have a wet season and a dry season. In this climatograph, you can probably see that, let's say, November through May is the wet season, and then June through October is the dry season. Okay, so many of them will have a wet and a dry season, but they will often not be completely dry during the drier season. It still rains, but it doesn't rain every day, or it doesn't rain as much. Because we're in the tropics, we have consistently high temperatures. So whenever you're reading these climatographs, again, from the previous PowerPoint, does it get below freezing? Is the temperature constant all year? Is there seasonal variation? What's the precipitation doing? Is it enough to support trees? Is it enough to support grasses? Or is it so little that it's a desert? In this case, we have lots and lots of rain, enough to support some of the largest trees in the world and the most densely packed forests in the world. And we have consistently high temperatures. Okay. There's also going to be high humidity because of that consistent moisture. And there's going to be various types of tropical rainforests, but we're not going to go into all the details there. We tend to find them between 0 and 15 degrees north and south, and from sea level to about 10,000 feet or 3,300 meters. Importantly, tropical rainforests have the highest net primary productivity among any terrestrial biomes. They're comparable in that sense to coral reefs and wetlands. Wetlands we are going to consider as a aquatic biome for the purposes of just like separating them out in this class, but it's kind of half terrestrial, half aquatic. But we're going to say that tropical rainforests have the highest net primary productivity among terrestrial biomes. Because of the consistent moisture and the consistent high temperatures, there is a lot of plant growth. Okay, so they can recover very quickly from disturbances, but they are going to take a really long time to mature into old growth forests. So what does that really mean? Let's say that we abandon a agricultural plot that we have down here in the top left corner in this diagram. After about 15 years, we're going to see shrubs recolonizing that area, and they're going to be relatively, getting to the maturity of shrubs. The large trees need shade to grow, so those seeds are going to be germinating in the soil, but those trees themselves need shade, and they're going to be the next generation of plants that are growing up through that. And then it's going to take maybe 100 years, 200 years for those trees to mature. Really, I very much simplified it. It could be that you have many different stages where you have these pioneer species and then several generations of different intermediate species until you get to the climax community. All right. There is very high biodiversity. About half of all plant and animal species occur in tropical rainforests. And there is a lot of niche partitioning in tropical rainforests. And one example of that is the forest structure, where we have these emergent trees that are the highest layer up at the top, and then the canopy layer that are making this dense canopy that are shading much of the understory and the forest floor. And you're going to find different plants and animals occupying all those different areas. The high biodiversity also, like I said, results in a lot of niche partitioning and um, a lot of like reduction of competition and a lot of specialization. You're going to have specialist species in tropical rainforests, a species of insects that only lives off of one species of tree, for example, or a species of bird like hummingbirds that only pollinate one group of flowers, or you have a species of a fungus that only lives in one tree. So that specialization leads to, again, niche partitioning, or the two of them lead to each other. There's a self-feeding cycle. Niche partitioning leads to specialization and vice versa. And you get very, very, very high biodiversity. That also means that there's a large threat for the biodiversity in tropical rainforests because if a species of tree goes, that might take with it 100 species of insects, fungi, bacteria, even vertebrates. Tropical rainforests tend to have very poor soils. They tend to be very low in nutrients and very low in organic matter. They tend to be slightly acidic, often slightly clayey soils. The reason that there's so little nutrients is because there's so much plant growth. Those plants are using all of the available nutrients that they can get out of the soil at like as soon as those nutrients are available. There's also very high rates of decomposition, so organic matter doesn't build up in the soils like it would in a temperate region. Because you have consistently high temperatures and consistent moisture, decomposition is super fast. So once dead leaves fall to the forest floor, or once a tree dies and falls down, the decomposers go through that really quickly and don't have a chance for any of that organic molecules to escape decomposition and build up in the soil as humus. Okay. There's also going to be high rates of leaching, which is another reason that there is so little organic matter, that leaching is going to take all of those nutrients down into the lower layers of the soil. Um, so there's going to be very, very, very little nutrients and very little carbon in the soils. However, there is a lot of carbon in the biomass of the plants, and it's a very large carbon sink because of those living plants that are storing carbon. Some of the ecosystem services of forests are timber and other building materials, food. However, people get food from the forests, and potential pharmaceuticals. We get a lot of our pharmaceuticals from living organisms, from the organic molecules that organisms produce. And there's a lot of untapped potential in the world for, like, there's a lot of organisms that we haven't studied for potential pharmaceuticals. And if tropical rainforests are home to half of the world's terrestrial species, then there's a lot of potential there for those species to have compounds that we could use as pharmaceuticals. Carbon sequestration, again, a large carbon sink, purification of water and air, regulation of local climate. They tend to cool the local landscape because of both shade and evapotranspiration. Whenever water evaporates, it cools the area. So you know, you have a lot of water evaporating off of all these surfaces, including transpirational water loss from all the leaves, and it cools the area. Now, ecosystem services we may not have defined yet. An ecosystem service is any service or anything that the natural landscape, the natural ecosystem provides for humans. Okay, so it's not a natural service, which would be something that nature does for nature. It's an ecosystem service, which is something that that nature does for people. So it's very human centric or very anthropocentric in that sense. Some of the threats that tropical rainforests face are deforestation. That is usually for agriculture or timber extraction, often for agriculture. Think of like the stereotype for that is either the Amazon being deforested for cattle ranches, soybean fields, and cornfields, or the Indonesian rainforests deforested for palm oil plantations. But both of those are for agricultural uses. We can see the rates of deforestation, or at least the amount that that these countries have lost in the bottom right-hand corner between 2000 and 2012, so only a little bit more than a decade. Brazil by far and away losing the most with the Amazon rainforest. Some solutions for that would be reforestation, afforestation, but really reforestation if we're talking about a place that's been deforested. Sorry that my lines are all squiggly. My mouse is acting up. Agroforestry is a huge one, so that'd be growing food in the forest. So something like shade-grown coffee, shade-grown chocolate, growing leafy greens in the understory of a otherwise more or less intact forest. And then silvopasture would be raising livestock in the forest. So that would be a great way to prevent deforestation. You could raise the livestock in the forest rather than deforesting it, convert it to pasture land, and then raising the livestock. On the bottom right, we have a picture of one of those palm oil plantations that I mentioned in the Indonesian and Bornean rainforests where we find the orangutans. So their habitat is threatened because of the monocultures of palm oil that is planted there. Other threats include poaching and hunting, damming of rivers, climate change. That's a huge one for the Amazon also, because climate change is projected to create a self reinforcing cycle where the forest gets drier, burns, turns into savanna, and then dries again, burns, turns to savanna, and we have a tipping point where we could lose the Amazon rainforest and it can get converted from forest into grassland. So with the tropical rainforest, we were looking at this deep green where we find them. The largest ones are in South America with the Amazon and the other associated forests. Not all of the tropical rainforests in South America are the Amazon, but that's the biggest one. The Congo rainforests and the Indonesian and Bornean rainforests. Those are the major ones. Next, we're getting into tropical dry forests. These are also called tropical seasonal forests, where there is a very pronounced wet and dry season. The wet season is usually not as wet as in a rainforest, and the dry season is often bone dry, where no drop of rain falls. Sometimes there's a little bit of rain, you see that in the climatograph in the bottom right, but usually, or a lot of the time, there's no rain that falls. Okay. Because there's very, very little moisture during the dry season, plants usually go dormant during that season and they lose their leaves. That process is making the plants deciduous, or the plants are deciduous in the sense that they lose their leaves. It's consistently hot, never dips below 0 degrees Celsius. So if we're looking at this climatograph over here, 0 degrees Celsius is down there, never gets even near 0 degrees Celsius. These tend to be just north and south of the tropical rainforests, getting further away from the equator. Again, we're starting at the equator and moving towards the poles in general with the order, the outline that I have this. These are very biologically diverse, although not as diverse as the rainforests, and many of the animals will be following the rains and then moving into rainforests or moving into savanna from the dry forests during the dry season. Some of them are residents year round, and obviously the plants don't move. They have to adapt, and a lot of them have adapted to have thorns or spines in order to prevent animals from grazing on them during the dry season. You can imagine that during the wet season, it may be okay if a plant loses some leaves, but if the animals start to graze on to start to eat the wood, the branches during the dry season, which is all that's left, the plants don't want that. It takes a lot more energy to create branches than it does to create leaves. So they protect those branches with thorns and spines. Here's a map of the tropical dry forests. You see that they are all throughout the tropics and subtropics, often associated with rain shadows. But we have some in South and Central America, some in Africa, and large portions in Madagascar. The largest continuous section is in the Indian subcontinent, and then again in Southeast Asia. The soils in tropical dry forests tend to be very dry and dusty during the dry season, so you can have a lot of, if there's not plants there holding that soil intact, you can have a lot of erosion. And then they tend to be very nutrient poor because during the wet season, all of those nutrients are being leached out of the soil or being leached further down into the soil column. So really poor soils. That's a problem for when these areas are deforested for agriculture, and the same exists for a tropical rainforest, which have poor soils. When they are deforested, you can only do agriculture there for a few years before you have to move on to the next plot and then deforest another area and keep marching further and further and further into the forest and deforesting as you go. Excuse me. Um, so yeah, although there is relatively high net primary productivity, it is much lower than tropical rainforests because of that pronounced dry season. Especially if the plants are deciduous and they're losing their leaves, you're not going to have as much photosynthetic activity happening during that dry season. So it's really going to drop the net primary productivity. So because of that, they're not going to recover as fast as a tropical rainforest, especially to that climax community of an old growth dry forest. Some of the ecosystem services would be timber, hunting, water and nutrient cycling, climate regulation. Again, all the biomass is a large carbon sink. Cooling the area with with evapotranspiration during the dry season, and then you can have some livestock grazing in the forest. Unfortunately, there are not many intact tropical dry forests. These are places that people have lived in for thousands of years, and especially recently have deforested large blocks in order to get into the international agricultural markets. So a lot of it is being deforested, and other areas have been impacted by human activity for a really long time, but especially recently. So there's really no large blocks of dry forest that are still intact that even have the potential to be destroyed. But those threats include deforestation, especially again for agriculture, like I've said. Poaching is a huge one. And then climate change, which can shift monsoon patterns, which the dry forests really rely on, which means that there could be decreased precipitation, meaning that it could eventually turn into a desert after you have all that soil erosion. So in this diagram, we were looking again at the tropical dry forest, and this one it is being shown as the monsoon forest. Um, Same thing, very similar. Maybe even getting into the tree savanna, and then definitely the tropical and subtropical dry forest. So you can see that there's some in South and Central America, Africa, much of the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia. And then the next one is the tropical grassland or the savanna. This is where we have grass as the dominant vegetation, but we have lots of wildflowers, which I am going to refer to as forbs for most of this PowerPoint. That's like the botanical term. There's going to be some shrubs. There's going to be the occasional tree. A lot of the time with the savanna, you'll have pockets of dry forest in the savanna, and then it'll just be, you know, almost continuous from savanna to dry forest to savanna. And we often see that distinction between the two can be quite blurred. Okay, there's a pronounced wet and dry season, very much the same as a tropical dry forest, just a little bit less precipitation during the wet season. Not enough precipitation to have a full forest, but enough precipitation for some isolated trees, small pockets of forest, and the grasses. In the grasslands, the animals typically, or at least the grazers, will typically follow the seasonal rains. Many of the predators are residents. They have their own territories, and they kind of await for those large herbivores to come through. Some of those predators will follow the herds, though. So they'll be follow the in this case, the wildebeest will be following the rains and trying to get that fresh grass as it grows most of the time. That has an like people have definitely impacted that as we create roads, cities, agricultural land, and fragment that habitat. There's a mutualistic relationship between the grazers, these herbivores, and the grasses. The grazers tend to eat the grasses but not kill them. They just eat them to right above the ground level. But they don't rip out the roots. They don't kill the plant. They don't destroy the crown of the plant, and the plant can regrow those grass leaves afterwards. Okay, that will stimulate the growth of new leaves and rhizomes, which are underground stems that allow one grass that's right here to send an underground stem across and then pop up another one. If any of you guys have grown strawberries, you're familiar with an above ground version of that called stolons. But if you've like ever pulled out a weed and you see this horizontal section that connects like one growing stem of the leaf to another, it's often a rhizome. Anyway, it stimulates the growth of the grasses. When the grazers graze, it stimulates the growth of the grasses. They will also eat the dry grass leaves during the dry season, which will reduce wildfire fuel and decrease the amount of dead matter on the ground, which opens up the ground for plants to grow. And they will kill young shrubs and trees, which compete with the grasses, by eating them. And they distribute the seeds in their waste. The grasses, they will sustain the grazers. So we have this mutualistic relationship where the grazers promote the grasses and keep the trees and shrubs down, and the grasses support those large herds of herbivores. Large herds of herbivores. If we look at a climatograph of a tropical grassland, we will see that the temperature never gets even close to freezing. Again, it's in the tropics, and we have a pronounced wet and dry season. In this case, the dry season has some rain, but in many cases, the dry season is bone dry. Keep an eye on the scale of the precipitation. Sometimes these will be in centimeters, sometimes they'll be in millimeters, but regardless, 175 centimeters during the wettest months is just not enough to support um, forest, but it is enough to support grasslands and isolated dry adapted trees. And then you have the pronounced dry season that the trees would really struggle in if this was going to try to be a forest, but enough to support grasses and isolated trees. Savannas have moderate net primary productivity, not as high as the forests because it's grasses rather than trees, so there's less photosynthetic activity, but is going to sustain a very high amount of biodiversity. So think about all of the different herbivores and predators on the African savanna. That's what it was like throughout the anywhere where there were and still are tropical grasslands, including in the Indian subcontinent and in South America. It does recover quickly from disturbances. Grasses are pretty quick to grow, but those grasses do have to establish themselves. And if erosion is faster than those plants can establish themselves, then we can have desertification occurring. It's going to be pretty quick if that disturbance doesn't kill the grasses. So if it's something like a fire, but it's going to be pretty slow if those grasses are destroyed. So if an area was plowed in order to grow an agricultural crop like millet or corn versus if there was just grazing or a fire. Okay. The soils tend to be pretty poor with leached nutrients, but sometimes, not often, but sometimes, they do have some deep carbon-rich soils. You do not see that in either of these two pictures, where the bottom one looks pretty dusty and dry soil, and the top one is that red clay that is very characteristic of much of Africa. Some of the ecosystem services include habitat, rangeland, especially for traditional nomadic herdsmen, but also for modern agriculture, hunting, medicinal plants, timber, nutrient and water cycling, many of the same things that we see in a lot of other ones. Okay, there are a lot of threats that tropical grasslands face. Habitat destruction, fragmentation, conversion to agricultural land. You see that throughout many different biomes. Um, but one of the unique things with the savanna is the presence of large predators. And in the past, and a little bit recently, but mostly in the past, like 1970s, 80s, 90s, there was in Africa some communities that were intentionally poisoning lions to protect their cattle so that the lions wouldn't take the cattle at night. They would poison the lions. They basically leave a poisoned pig carcass outside, and the lions would eat it, scavenge it, and then they would die. Overgrazing is something that is going to be affecting many of our different biomes. So if we do not manage that rangeland properly, we could lead to overgrazing, which leads to soil erosion and eventually desertification. And that's one of the big issues with the tropical savanna as well. Poaching is a huge one, especially in Africa, for elephant ivory and rhino horn and bushmeat. Whenever you guys see a picture of this, imagine that each of these two um, tusks represents a single individual elephant. So this is dozens of elephants just piled up in that one picture. Civil unrest, including civil war, again, in Africa, in several countries over the past 100 years, there have been civil wars, civil unrest, and animals can get caught in the crossfire. They could be hunted for bushmeat to feed armies, and we can have habitat destruction of even national parks like Gorongosa National Park during a civil war. And then climate change, increasing drought, which increases soil erosion, which also can lead to desertification. So again, moving out from the equator, we have our grass savanna and tree savanna in this image. And we see that as we move from the equator, tropical rainforest to tropical dry forest to savanna. Now that's not going to be the same everywhere, right? East Africa, we have a little bit, it's a little bit different, but focus on West Africa, where we start with rainforest to dry forest to savanna. And that would be followed by xeric shrubland. Now, if you look at the map of this, I couldn't find a map just of xeric shrubland, but this one includes both deserts and xeric shrubland, and they tend to intermingle with one another. You'll have a desert that is technically a desert because of the low rainfall, and it is supporting enough shrubs or supporting shrubs, and it's a shrubland. It's still a desert. Okay. This is a very arid biome. It's dominated by dry adapted shrubs, grasses, forbs, small trees, succulents, and in the Americas, cacti. It's interspersed with and among the deserts, like I said, and it is often going to be seasonal. In the tropics, you tend to have a wet and dry season. In the temperate regions, you tend to have a summer and winter. So to illustrate that, let's look at a couple places in North America. I'm going to start here and closer to the tropics because we've been in the savanna. So as we move a little bit north, we're still going to be in the subtropics, Cabo San Lucas and Mexico, where you see that there is very little difference in temperature year round, and it doesn't get anywhere near 0 degrees Celsius. Okay, so it's hot all year round. There's just a wet season and a dry season. We can contrast that with Reno, Nevada, where there is a pronounced summer and winter. It is temperate, still is xeric shrubland, still has a wet and dry season, but what I'm focusing on here is the temperature, and it does get below freezing on average throughout the winter. Okay, so the temperature can really vary, but there tends to be very low moisture. There is low net primary productivity in xeric shrublands, but there tends to be higher than in true deserts. That should make sense. Shrubs are larger plants, and they should be doing more photosynthesis than isolated grasses or cacti in a desert. Okay. They're often deciduous, so a lot of these plants are going to lose their leaves during the dry season. There's going to be low-ish biodiversity, but still surprisingly high. A lot of these animals are going to be some of the same animals that we'll see in like a temperate grassland or a montane forest, where in North America we'll have black bear or mountain lions. Previously, before humans extirpated them or killed them off in these regions, we would even have some grizzly bear in some of our xeric shrublands, mule deer, all kinds of large animals, some that you may not expect. They probably would have lower population sizes, but some of the same animals. Okay, they do have a very slow recovery time because there's little photosynthetic activity, low NPP, so slow growing vegetation, but again, a little bit faster than a true desert. You tend to have very thin soil, very little organic matter in that soil, nutrient poor as well. Some of the ecosystem services include habitat, rangeland, which means that we're grazing our livestock on that, hunting, medicinal plants, etc. Many of these are repeating and they're going to continue repeating throughout this. Some of the threats: habitat destruction and fragmentation. Again, that's true for pretty much every biome. Conversion to agricultural land. Mostly that's going to be ranching, especially in the western United States. A lot of our public land on the Bureau of Land Management is being used for rangeland. And there is the potential for overgrazing. And in fact, some of the cattle ranchers are consistently lobbying Congress or the Bureau of Land Management to allow them to increase the number of head of cattle that they can have on any specific section of land, and that leads to overgrazing. You could have like quote unquote deforestation because there can be some small trees, mostly shrubs, but some small trees. So, for example, mesquite in the desert Southwest can be used for cooking, smoking meats and stuff like that. Climate change, again, increased drought, increased soil erosion, and desertification. Desertification, turning it into a true desert, kind of going from these shrubs. You can imagine in this image, the shrubs disappearing because people either cut them down or animals graze on them too heavily. And then it's nothing but sand and some isolated plants, true desert. So to illustrate the overgrazing, I have these two photos that I took literally right across the fence from one another, and Craters of the Moon National Monument and just outside of the National Monument in Idaho. So Western United States, xeric shrubland, or at least sagebrush steppe, similar biome that we're not really going to focus on. We'll call it similar to a xeric shrubland for our purposes right now. In the National Monument, you can't have any cattle. You can see all of the grasses in between the shrubs, and you can see more biodiversity in the picture in the top right versus on the bottom left, literally across the fence. I just literally hopped a barbed wire fence in order to take the picture on the bottom left. That's on Bureau of Land Management land, and you can see how little grasses and wildflowers and other plants are in between those shrubs, that sagebrush. So that has been overgrazed. If wind was to kick up really strong, or if there was a heavy rain, you can imagine that the dust would get picked up by the wind, erosion of soil, or during a heavy rain, that soil can be washed away downhill. So continuing to move north of the equator, I like using Africa, West Africa as an example of this. Tropical rainforest to tropical dry forest to savanna to xeric shrubland. Next, we're going to move into our true deserts. You can see how as we move further away from the equator, we're going into these different biomes. Now, one thing to note for the true deserts and the xeric shrublands, remember what's going on at 30 degrees north and south with those Hadley cells and why we tend to have deserts in those belts 30 degrees north and south. Not always, not everywhere around the planet, but predominantly those are where we find our deserts. So a desert is typically defined as an area that receives less than 25 centimeters of rain per year. That includes a lot of different biomes, though. It includes arid deserts, extreme deserts, tropical deserts, temperate deserts, xeric shrubland, and polar deserts. But we're going to ignore those for this. It's just technically it does include it. Okay, I'm going to erase that just because I don't want to give anybody a false impression because those are true deserts or they are really deserts, but they're polar deserts. We're not going to talk about them. I'm going to try to say true desert when I mean a desert. High temperatures, but again, if we're going to be in Utah, those temperatures can dip below freezing during the winter. If we're in the Sahara, if they're going to stay above freezing on average in our climatographs. Very low precipitation. You should be able to tell a desert because it's going to have the smallest amount of precipitation compared to any of the other biomes. The soils tend to be thin, although people tend to characterize deserts as like sand dunes. That's only a very small minority of deserts. Many deserts have either rocky soil, they can have sandy soil that is just barely covering rock. It can be compacted clay soils. They don't have to be sand dunes. That's just the iconic picture that people have in their mind. A lot of the time it's just, really thin, clayey or sandy, rocky soil. There may be no O horizon. There may be a very thin A horizon. It really just kind of depends. Some of them are just going to have exposed bedrock. For those of you guys that have done some hiking in Utah, you probably know what I'm talking about. Many deserts are going to have cryptobiotic crusts on their soils, so you do have to be familiar with this term. Um, this is a thin layer of fungi, lichens, algae, bacteria that can live on the soil surface, and they start to stabilize the soil. They start to provide that first amount of organic matter in the soil. This is a couple pictures, both from afar and close up, that I took in western Colorado, where we see that cryptobiotic crust. Look at all the different colors on this, and the black, the gray, this kind of orangish, greenish, yellow. That's all cryptobiotic crust. All of those different colors that you see there that are not that reddish, tan, sandy soil looking color, that's all the cryptobiotic crust. And you can see how the cryptobiotic crust is holding this bit of soil together while the soil around it has eroded away. Okay, so they tend to hold the soil together. They cover a surprisingly large amount of the soil surface. About 12% of the Earth's surface is covered by cryptobiotic crust. They stabilize the soil, they fix nitrogen into the soil, they start to add some soil nutrients to it, they start to add some organic matter. They capture water and they prevent that water from flowing off and they hold on to that water, but they are very delicate. If you step on this stuff, and you've probably seen signs about this if you've hiked in Western Colorado or Arizona or Utah or Nevada or Eastern California, Southeast California, you've probably seen signs about that, how you have to stay on the path so that you don't disturb the soil because these guys grow really slowly and it takes a really long time for them to come back after even just people walking on them. Unsurprisingly, in deserts, the net primary productivity is very low. It's the lowest of any terrestrial biome except for ice sheets. The species richness is therefore low, but you do have some very unique species that live in deserts that are adapted for those deserts, for those dry conditions, both plants and animals. Recovery from disturbance, extremely slow. They often don't recover and they just become degraded. The threats and the ecosystem services for deserts, just copy and paste xeric shrubland, and then except for anything that regards wood, such as the deforestation and quotes. All right. Continuing to move north and south of the equator, or from the equator, we get to the chaparral, which is one of the rarest biomes around the world. These regions are not geographically linked like many of the other ones that we've talked about so far. So look how isolated they are from one another. We don't have any connection between these different areas. So the plants that evolve in these areas tend to be very unique. They tend to be very rare and they're found nowhere else in the world. They're often not even found in the surrounding biomes. So for example, in California, you have a lot of plants that are adapted to and endemic, meaning not found anywhere else, but they're endemic to the chaparral and they don't occur in the nearby grasslands or nearby forests. Okay. Um, Even within a specific region, the chaparral can be relatively, they can occur in pockets. Those pockets can be relatively isolated from one another. So, for example, a wildflower that evolves in this little pocket may be isolated from another little pocket, and they can diverge over time and lead to the formation of new species. Okay, so they tend to be very unique um, floras, and the fauna, maybe not as much, but still unique fauna. This is a semi-arid biome. We tend to have some trees that are adapted for dry conditions, but dominated by shrubs, wildflowers, grasses. Now, one of the things that you may have noticed on the previous slide is that the chaparral tends to only occur in temperate regions near the ocean or the Mediterranean Sea, okay, which I'm just going to call the ocean because it's connected to the greater Atlantic Ocean through the Gibraltar Strait. But anyway, they're next to the ocean, and that ocean moderates the temperature. So even though they're temperate, they don't have freezing conditions during the winter. So even though they're in the same latitude as a temperate grassland or a temperate deciduous forest that would freeze during the winter, they don't. They don't experience freezing temperatures, which is very unique among the temperate biomes. They tend to, however, have a very pronounced wet and dry season, and during that dry season, it may never rain. So, for example, until recently, with global climate change, the the um, the stereotype of LA was that it didn't rain at all during the summer months, and then you get all your rain during the winter, and it would rain during the winter, not snow, because it doesn't get below freezing. Um, all right. Those dry summers, though, they fuel frequent fires. So fire is very common in the chaparral. And the crazy thing is, there's even some AP test questions I've seen about this. If you have a very wet winter, you have a lot of biomass that is formed. So imagine that, November through April, you have a really wet winter. That winter, which again is not getting below freezing, so the plants still have their leaves, the plants are still growing, they're making lots and lots and lots of biomass. But then if you have an exceptionally dry summer that follows that, that biomass that was made during that winter is now dry fuel for the fire that summer. So the wetter the winter, the more biomass you can have, and the drier the summer, the more intense the fires can be. And those fires are only intensifying with global climate change. You have moderate net primary productivity in the chaparral that is due to the aridity during the summer. So I would compare it to a little bit more than a xeric shrubland, okay, but less than a temperate deciduous forest. The biodiversity is relatively moderate, but it does have a lot of endemic species. So there's a lot of species that are, especially of plants, that are not found anywhere else. On animals, yes, you do have some endemics, but a lot of the animals will move between the chaparral and the surrounding grasslands or forests. The recovery from the disturbance can be relatively quick. That depends on the disturbance. If it's a fire, you have fire adapted plants that can recover really quickly. But if you disturb the soil through plowing, or if you deforest that area and those trees grow relatively slow, then that can be a more severe disturbance that will recover over a slower amount of time or over a longer amount of time. Soils can vary widely. They can be very productive and fertile and very deep, especially in some of our valleys. Like think about the valleys in central California, for example. Even if it's not true chaparral, it's right next to it. Or the agricultural centers of ancient Rome around the Mediterranean were mostly chaparral. But they could also be very thin and rocky, like in the pictures that you see on the right. So unfortunately, with the chaparral being such a rare biome covering very little land area around the world, and because it has such moderate climate that people like to move to, and it is very conducive to agriculture, about 90% of the chaparral has been converted to agricultural land or urban or suburban development. So about 90% has been lost. That includes especially the areas around the Mediterranean where people have lived for thousands of years. But recently, the in California, South Australia, South Africa, and the southwest of South America. The ecosystem services, much the same as xeric shrublands, but it includes all of these down here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read them all to you. Some of the threats, again, the same as xeric shrubland, but more so for agriculture than xeric shrubland, which is mostly converted into grazing for livestock. A lot of the chaparral has been converted into agricultural land, especially as you probably read on the last slide. A lot of our agricultural crops, especially those that we think of in the United States, descend from wild ancestors that were from chaparral regions. That includes oats and barley and wheat, even though those are getting into the grasslands, but there's a lot of grass in chaparral. That includes olive and grape, fig. Those traditional kind of Southern European, North African crops, Middle East, Mediterranean crops are really good at growing in the chaparral because that's what they were adapted for. But anyway, a lot of the same as xeric shrubland. So the chaparral is a little bit difficult to pick up off of this graph, but it is the purple color. You see it in Southern California, across the Mediterranean, especially like North Africa, the western portion of the Middle East, and then Southern Europe. You have some in Southern Australia, a little bit in South Africa, and a little bit along the coast of South America, west coast of South America. Moving from the chaparral, we get to the temperate grassland, and I want you to look at that map on the bottom right and see how the temperate grassland overlaps and is next to often the chaparral, especially in Southern California and the Mediterranean region, but also South Africa and Southern Australia. Okay, so often borders the chaparral. It tends to, because it is temperate, we are getting to our first areas where it tends to go below freezing during the winter, but that's really going to depend on where you are. In southern Spain, it's not going to get below freezing, but in like southern Canada, it is going to get below freezing. Or if you're in the Central Asian steppe, it's definitely going to get below freezing during the winter. Usually for the temperate grassland, below freezing for a couple months during the winter, on average temperature is what you are going to see. You often will see a wet and a dry season, but we're not going to worry about that because now we're into our temperate regions where we aren't worried so much about wet and dry. We're worried about summer and winter. Okay. Typically not enough precipitation for grasses, but sorry, not enough precipitation for trees, but enough precipitation for grasses. The heights of those grasses are going to differ based off of the amount of precipitation. In the United States, in North America at least, the United States and southern Canada, as you move from the eastern side to the west, we tend to go from in the east, tall grass prairie where there was lots and lots and lots of moisture. Think Ohio, Illinois, where we would have tall grass prairie, where it would be over 6 feet tall grasses, 7, 8 feet tall grasses in some cases. And then as you go a little bit further west, it gets a little bit drier. We get to the mixed grass prairie where it's a mixture of tall and short grasses. And then when we get to a place like Denver, Colorado, where we're at, it's the short grass prairie where the grasses may only be um, a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet high. Okay. Even the mature flowers on those grasses may be 4 feet tall, but mostly 3 feet or less. So that all depends on the precipitation. Again, these are seasonal, so you're looking for that classic dip during the winter and the rise during the summer in temperature. The temperature does vary extremely. Think about some of those places that I mentioned where we have really hot summers and pretty cold winters. Dry summers, not so much the case in this climatograph, but in many climatographs for the temperate grassland, we're going to see dry summers and coupled with thunderstorms that just roll through really quickly, dump 5 minutes of rain, but then lots of lightning strikes, maybe even a dry thunderstorm where it doesn't even rain, but you have lots of lightning that can spark grass fires, and grass fires are very common. And that symbiotic relationship between the large herbivores, the grazers, and the grasses exists here as it did in the savanna. And we talked a little bit about that with the bison for those of you guys that went to Genesee Park on the field trip. Now, temperate grasslands are the first biome that we're getting to where there is more carbon in the soil than there is carbon in the vegetation. So temperate grasslands can have very deep carbon-rich soils. Look at how deep this soil is compared to this normal-sized human being right there. Notice how deep those grass roots go. The ones on the left, the ones on the right are agricultural crops, probably wheat. I think that's wheat. In this case, very shallow rooted crops that are annuals, but the ones on the left are perennial. They live year after year after year, and the grasses grow deeper over those years. But anyway, notice how dark that soil is. Remember, whenever you think about dark soils, think about high carbon content. The reason that the soils of Ohio and Illinois and Indiana and Iowa and Wisconsin are so fertile is because of this large carbon reservoir. How does the carbon get into the soil? Well, a couple ways. First off, you have these deep-rooted perennial grasses that that eventually will die, and those roots stay in the soil and they decompose in the soil, but they don't decompose fully in the soil because decomposition is slowed down during the winter. And when you get deeper down into the soil, there's less oxygen and less microbial activity. So not all of the grass root will decompose, and some of it will be left as humus. On the surface, you have dead grass leaves that fall to the floor or to the ground surface, and not all of those leaves are going to decompose because, again, winter is going to slow down decomposition, and they can get buried through sedimentation and through more dead leaves, and they work their way down into the soil through earthworm activity and everything, and not all of that organic matter decomposes. These do take a long time to form, but they are again very carbon rich, huge carbon store. So protecting our grasslands is one way to combat climate change because they store lots and lots and lots of carbon. Agricultural soils in the Midwest of the United States, though, have become a carbon source recently rather than a carbon sink as people plow them intensively and as those soils erode away due to poor farming techniques. In the temperate grassland, there is moderate net primary productivity. Again, not as much as forests, but way more than deserts. They do sustain high biodiversity. One crazy thing about the temperate grassland is that they can have over 50 plant species per square meter. So you lay a square meter down on a intact temperate grassland, and you can find many, many, many different species, tens of species. Those include several different species of grasses, several different species of wildflowers, the mosses that might be growing right on the ground surface, the lichen that might be growing right on the ground surface, but mostly grasses and wildflowers. They can recover quickly from disturbances, especially those that don't kill the roots or the crowns of those plants. But any of them that do, such as plowing, can result in very long recovery times. So to illustrate some of the biodiversity of temperate grasslands, Aldo Leopold, who is a great nature writer, this is from the Sand County Almanac, he talks about how every week during April and September there are on average 10 wild plants that bloom for the first time. So this is in the temperate grassland again. In June, as many as a dozen species will burst their buds or bloom on a single day. So that biodiversity of the temperate grasslands. And then he goes on to talk about some of the loss of that biodiversity as we turn the grasslands into agricultural land. So losing the bison, losing these cutleaf silphiums. I'll let you guys read this quote. I'm not going to read this quote to you, but I think it's a really powerful quote, so I would like for you to read it. Some of the ecosystem services for grasslands, we've talked about many of these before. Again, I won't read it to you because a lot of it is overlapping, but you guys should know these ones and some of the threats. Um, Again, many of them are the same as we get into these biomes. They do tend to repeat. But one thing that I want to highlight is this bullet point right here. About 99% of the U.S. tallgrass prairie is gone. It's been converted into agricultural land, and then a small portion of it has been converted into suburban and urban landscapes. So from the temperate grasslands, at the same latitude, we're going to be moving into the temperate deciduous forests. If we were to be moving north, we'd be moving into the boreal forests, and we'll talk about the deciduous forest next. So the temperate deciduous forest is going to occur at the same latitude, more or less, as our temperate grasslands, but it's going to occur in areas that get higher precipitation, sometimes higher seasonally, but usually consistently high precipitation, as you see on the climatograph on the right for New York City. It's going to be dominated by angiosperm trees, what we're going to call broadleaf trees in this class. Those would be things like think about oaks, maples, birch, beech, aspens, poplars, chestnut, walnut, all of those different species of trees. Really think most things besides conifers. Okay, they're pines and spruces. However, there are going to be some of those coniferous trees, some of those conifers. There's going to be lots of understory shrubs, some grasses, but sometimes you're going to have just an open forest floor underneath of the dense canopy where there's just leaf litter and no plants growing up in the understory except for young trees. Definitely a seasonal ecosystem. You see it on the right-hand side on the chromatograph where we have the very characteristic spike in temperature in summer and then the dip in temperature during the winter. Depending on the latitude, some of them are going to go below freezing during the winter, some of them are not, or at least will consistently go below freezing to where the average temperature for the month is below freezing. Places like Maine are going to go below freezing, whereas some place like Alabama will not. Okay, even in this one for New York City, the average is above freezing, right? So the temperate deciduous forests are going to have deep, rich soils. They're going to have a deep O horizon, lots of leaf litter on the ground, deep A horizon because those leaves are consistently decomposing and creating that organic matter, that humus and the soil that is being brought down into that A horizon by microbial and earthworm and beetle activity. It's going to have moderately high NPP, lower than our tropical forests because we're in the temperate latitudes and these are deciduous trees, so they're going to lose their leaves during the winter. Okay, so they're not going to be photosynthesizing for half the year. Moderately high biodiversity, a lot of unique species in the temperate deciduous forests, but also a lot of overlap between the grasslands and the boreal forests that we'll talk about in a minute. And they can take quite a while to recover from disturbances, even though the trees will come up from seed relatively quickly. It's going to take decades to centuries for those trees to mature into mature trees, into the old growth forest. Ecosystem services will include many of the same ones that we've talked about with some of the other biomes. Timber, habitat, nutrient and water cycling. Water purification is a big one because of the deep, rich soils and the filtering properties of soils for water. Climate regulation, it's a very large carbon sink. You have lots of biomass both above ground and below ground in the soils, right? Deep, rich soils. The threats, many of the same ones that we've seen. Invasive species, especially in the United States, have been a big one. Chestnut blight has basically wiped out the American chestnut, mostly. Like there's still individuals that have survived, but off the top of my head, I would say just making up a number, 98 to 99 or over percent decrease. Dutch elm disease, same thing. Emerald ash borer is ravaging the ash trees in the United States. So those invasive species are a big one here. And temperate deciduous forest, which this diagram is showing as temperate broadleaf forest, you can see is very widely distributed throughout the temperate latitudes in both the northern and southern hemisphere, although because there's less land mass in the southern hemisphere, it is occupying a little bit less of the land of the territory in the southern hemisphere. A lot of that has been lost to development or agriculture. Like for any of you guys that have been to the island of Ireland, Ireland has lost most of its temperate deciduous forests because they've converted it over the centuries into pasture land for sheep and into cropland to grow hay for those sheep or for the cattle or for row crops like wheat or potatoes or corn. All right, and then the temperate rainforest. Similar-ish to the temperate deciduous forest, but we have lots and lots and lots of rainfall. Rainfall is just very, very high in these regions. You can see them typically hugging the coasts, whether those coasts are of the ocean or some large inland lakes. But then you also have a pocket that is in South Central Asia, in southern China. Okay, so along with I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but since I just mentioned it, along with the temperate deciduous forest, a lot of deforestation. I mean, look at the island of Ireland for all kinds of reasons, but mostly for agricultural land or for development. Um, the temperate rainforest has many unique species because these rainforests are not geographically linked to each other like some of our other biomes are. You have species that occur only in these small pockets of habitat on either New Zealand or the islands of Japan, the western edges of the European continent, some very unique ecosystems hugging the Black and Caspian seas but very unique ecosystems. Because they're near the coast, they have moderate temperatures, and those temperatures rarely get below freezing for the monthly average. So you often see this increase during the summer, but a decrease during the winter, but not below freezing. Even up here in the further north regions of the the temperate rainforest and in southeast Alaska, like around Juneau, it'll get below freezing, but it's not as cold as similar places in the same latitude that are more inland because you have that buffering effect of the ocean out on the coast. Okay, that coast is what's providing all the water, and you typically have a rain shadow, which is what you have in these ones that are in more Central Asia. All right. Again, very high precipitation, sometimes reaching many feet per year or many meters per year, but very, very high precipitation. I mean, if we have 2.5 meters or 2.25 meters of precipitation in just 1 month, that is a whole lot of rain. Okay. Because we have a lot of rain, we tend to have pretty much every surface covered with vegetation. That is even including the bark of the trees that are covered by mosses and lichens, as you see in the pictures on the bottom and on the top left. Um, the flora is usually dominated by coniferous trees. That's usually going to be cedars and redwoods, hemlocks, firs, and pines, but it may also include broadleaf trees or in Asia, bamboo. Very thick forests, very dense understory with lots of understory plants, including mosses, ferns, forbs, and grasses, but usually not as many grasses, mostly, the mosses, ferns, forbs. Um, High NPP, moderately high to high NPP, because you have moderate winters, lots of rainfall, and you can do photosynthesis, if not year-round, most of the year. Moderately high biodiversity, there's a lot of unique organisms in these forests, like I said, and a lot of species interactions and symbioses that occur due to the amount of vegetation that is there. The ecosystem services, the threats, more or less the same as for temperate deciduous forest, but because this is a rare biome, the deforestation is more significant or more like impactful because there's so little land mass that's covered by it. For example, historically, the Lebanon cedar forests have lost about 99.6 of its historic range. The coastal redwoods, like you see over here on the right, have lost 96% of their range, and over 99% of the UK and Ireland rainforests have been lost. They've been converted to agricultural land. That is often being used for agricultural land, but in some cases timber. Like for the Lebanon cedar and the coastal redwood, it was mostly for timber extraction. All right, and if we keep moving north, we will head into the boreal forest, which is the largest contiguous biome of the world. Even if it doesn't appear contiguous based off of this map, when the Bering Land Bridge linked Asia to North America, it was the largest contiguous biome in the world, and it's still considered to be the largest contiguous biome in the world because you can have movement from Asia into North America a little bit, and even just this broad section in Eurasia is the largest contiguous belt of any biome in the world. So when you're looking at a climatograph of this, you're gonna see that it gets very cold in the winter, right? On average, for an average day in January, for it being, negative 14 degrees Celsius in this locale, that's very, very cold. You're gonna have moderately cool summers, but warm enough to do lots of photosynthesis. The plants that are going to be dominating this are mostly going to be gymnosperms or conifers, which include the hemlocks, spruces, firs, and pines. But you're also going to have some other trees that are angiosperms, your broadleaf hardwood trees like alder, aspen, and birch. This is, like I said, a very seasonal biome. And when you're looking at the climatographs, you're not going to see a lot of precipitation, not as much as you would expect for a forest. But all the rain that falls during the summer is definitely enough to sustain these types of trees that are often relatively dry adapted. But it's really the snowfall during the winter The snowfall during the winter, even if it doesn't look like a lot on this diagram, and it really isn't, it doesn't melt until the spring, and then it melts in the spring, saturates the soil, and then the soils hold on to that water because they're shaded and because it's cool, and they provide lots of water all year long for those trees to grow. The MPP and the species diversity are both moderate, and this is due to those long, cold winters. Daylight hours are going to be very short during the winter, but that also means that daylight hours are going to be very long during the summer. So during the growing season, you might have, 14 to 20, even up to 22 hours of daylight, depending on the latitude. Slow recovery due to those short growing seasons. So even if it's like sunny all day, it's a very short growing season, maybe like 2 to 4, maybe 5 months for the growing season. The ecosystem services and threats are mostly the same as the temperate deciduous forest, but there is some things that I want to highlight. The first is the climate regulation. This is a very large carbon sink. We'll talk about permafrost in a few slides, but the soil underneath of some of the boreal forest is permafrost. Not all of it, not most of it, but some of it is permafrost. And that permafrost melts and it can release CO2 and CH4, both greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere from the decomposition of the organic matter that's in that permafrost. Permafrost is basically just soil that's frozen year after year. It's permanently frozen soil. And if that soil is frozen, there's going to be no decomposition. Once it thaws, decomposition occurs. All right. The boreal forest is even turning from a carbon sink into a carbon source from both thawing permafrost and the more frequent fires that we are starting to see. So, like 2023 or 2024 were both huge years for fires in the Canadian boreal forests. You're also seeing fire years in the Siberian boreal forests where we didn't used to see fires, and those fires are becoming um, increasingly common and increasingly severe. Deforestation is another big threat, habitat destruction, development, and then again, fires in areas where we didn't used to see fires, and then that melting permafrost releasing CO2 and CH4. So the boreal forest or the taiga, both you'll see, so either boreal forest or taiga is this section right here. We are going to continue moving further north and into the tundra. But before we go north, let's divert ourselves into a higher altitude or a higher elevation into the alpine tundra. So a lot of, okay, this is kind of weird. In Colorado, where you guys are used to this, we're not going to call the coniferous forests, the pine forests and spruce and fir forests that we have boreal forest. We're going to call them montane forest. But above that tree line, above those coniferous forests, we have the alpine tundra. This occurs at high elevations, it's in mountainous areas or high plateaus like the Tibetan Plateau. That elevation is going to vary based off of the latitude. The lower the latitude, the closer to the equator, the higher tree line tends to be. And then the closer to the poles, the lower tree line tends to be, just because the conditions become more severe. So it's around 1,500 feet in Alaska, where it's 11,000 feet here in Colorado. It's treeless, it's defined by being above tree line, and it's often underlaid by permafrost, but that soil can often be thin and rocky, although in some cases it may be many meters deep. And that permafrost is also going to be storing carbon. It's a very harsh biome. There's thin air because there's less oxygen in the air, especially at those higher elevations, at the lower latitudes. The ultraviolet radiation is extreme up there. You guys probably know that if you go up above tree line, you get sunburned really quick. The winds are extreme, and the winds, more than anything else, are what limit tree growth. You have low temperatures, a very short growing season, often a thin rocky soil, and it can be quite dry, which you wouldn't think because it's often covered in snow. But a lot of that time, that snow blows off in the high winds of the winter, and it settles in the forests below on the slopes of the mountains and in the subalpine zone. something like right here, you can actually have way, way, way more moisture because the wind is carrying snow from above down below into that subalpine forest. So the alpine tundra is left without the snow, without the moisture, so it can be quite dry. Plants and animals have to be adapted to those extremes. Most of the animals are going to migrate. The plants are going, or they're going to hibernate. Some of them overwinter in the alpine tundra, but very few, in terms of staying active during the winter. And those that do tend to be underneath the snow. Um, but most of them are either going to migrate or hibernate. Most of the plants are going to be deep-rooted perennials, and they are going to have lots of different strategies to combat the extreme conditions of wind and ultraviolet radiation, which include hairy leaves to limit the amount of transpirational water loss, and red pigments like carotenoids or betalains that'll betaloids, the ones found in the beet family, that are going to reflect that solar radiation. So the NPP of the alpine tundra is going to be very low. It's among the lowest of any of the terrestrial biomes, only higher than stuff like deserts and some xeric shrublands. Um, it's because of the short growing season, because of the cold, because of the low precipitation, because of the high winds and that extreme environment that those plants find themselves in. But you do have a lot of unique species that live in the alpine tundra. There's just not a lot of species. So those species that do occur are quite unique, but there's not very many species in total. Tends to be very pretty areas, lots of wildflowers, lots of interesting flora going on, and very species diverse per square meter. The alpine tundra is again, often characterized by very unique species because you're going to have some plant species that are adapted to the mountains that are totally different and isolated from the species growing in the lowlands that surround it. And those mountains that they're adapted to may be completely cut off from other mountains. So they develop very unique adaptations and they evolve into new, different, and unique species. Even in some mountainous areas, some mountains are going to have some species that other mountains don't. And even though it looks like a contiguous area of red down here on this world map, zoom in on this area in the Andes Mountains, where you can see that each little alpine tundra is its own little island of habitat that's separated from other islands, other peaks. The ecosystem services, humans don't get a lot from the alpine tundra, but we do get some. That includes habitat for wild animals, some pasture land, and some of that pasture land has been managed sustainably for centuries, such as areas of the Tibetan Plateau where people have run livestock, including yaks and yaks and donkeys and horses on that area for thousands of years, and they haven't degraded that ecosystem, as well as some areas in the Swiss Alps where they bring their cattle up every single summer to graze in those alpine meadows or that alpine tundra, and they keep the population density low enough that they don't overgraze that area. Water cycling is huge. The alpine tundra and surrounding mountains, surrounding lowlands of the mountains, are the headwaters for many of the world's rivers, including the world's major rivers. It includes water storage in glaciers, and as those glaciers melt, sea level is rising. Climate regulation, again, the permafrost is a large carbon sink. There's a lot of organic matter from those dead plants that is frozen into the soil. The threats: habitat destruction and fragmentation, unsustainable grazing, tourism, including hiking off trail, is huge. Again, very slow recovery time. If any of you guys have hiked in the alpine tundra, um, they always recommend that you stay on the trail because even just walking over an area once or twice or three times can severely damage those plants, and their recovery time is really slow. A lot of the time, if you're hiking in the alpine tundra, they'll tell you not to walk in single file because just three or four people can create a new social trail by killing those plants. They'll tell you to walk shoulder to shoulder so that each plant only has one footfall on it. Climate change is impacting the alpine tundra in two ways. Tree line is advancing higher up the mountains. We have documented evidence throughout the world of tree line going higher up the mountains over the past 150 years or so, but really accelerating since around 1950. That is a relatively slow process because it takes a while for trees to grow, but we see tree line advancing up the mountains, and that's literally pushing species into a smaller habitat. And then thawing permafrost, which again releases CO2 and CH4 as that organic matter that is trapped in the permafrost thaws and then decomposes and releases those two greenhouse gases. So the alpine tundra isn't really visible throughout a lot of this diagram, but it is very visible in the Andes Mountains and the Tibetan Plateau, but there's a lot of high mountains. I would reference the other picture for the alpine tundra. All right, now we're heading north into the Arctic tundra. The Arctic tundra is sometimes called the Arctic desert because there's such little precipitation. What does fall in the summer is often rain, but even often snow during the summer, and then obviously snow during the winter. Extremely cold, very short growing season. Even if there is 18 to 24 hours of daylight during that short growing season, it might only be 2 months of growing season. The soil tends to be underlain by permafrost. Permafrost is permanently frozen soil, and it's often frozen at depth that can be like thousands of meters deep in extreme examples. Often it's tens to hundreds of meters deep. So you see some examples of permafrost over here on the right. Permafrost you will often see as a very dark colored soil because it contains lots and lots and lots of organic matter. And in both of these cases, you see some ice wedges. The ice wedges are where water has seeped into that permafrost and it is pooled up and it's created this wedge of ice. And as the permafrost kind of freezes, that wedge becomes wider and deepens itself. A lot of areas can be very dry in the tundra, but some areas receive a lot of precipitation and you can get the formation of bogs, which in the tundra they often call muskegs. I think it's a Russian word. But you also get marshes and shallow lakes, often very common. You have a lot of peat moss that grows and peat bogs that form as well. And all of those store lots and lots and lots of carbon, especially if they're underlaid by permafrost. So the soils of the Arctic tundra can be some of the most carbon-rich soils around the planet, where you have, like I said, tens to hundreds to even thousands of meters deep of just permanently frozen soil and lots of undecomposed organic matter that is locked in that soil, and that organic matter contains carbon. However, it does have low net primary productivity, again, only second to deserts. Very slow recovery due to that short growing season, very similar to the alpine tundra, very floristically similar to the alpine tundra as well. You have a lot of plants that their home base, let's say, their central range is in the Arctic tundra, but then they extend south along the mountain peaks into areas like the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, where we share some of the same plants as those that are found in northern Alaska, just in the high alpine tundra of our mountains. Um, so floristically, very similar to the Arctic tundra, or sorry, the alpine tundra. Ecosystem services, again, a lot of repeats, habitat, pasture land, especially for reindeer, but increasingly even cattle and sheep, um, horses as well. Ancestral lands is some of the oldest cultures in the world. There's like oldest contiguous cultures in the world. Water cycling is a huge one. This is a large store of water, especially in the lakes and muskegs. If any of you guys have flown over northern Canada and looked out the window and seen just like lake after lake after lake after lake, there is a lot of water in the Arctic tundra. A lot of it is frozen also in the permafrost. And then climate regulation. Permafrost is one of the large carbon sinks around the planet, and that organic matter gets trapped in that permafrost before it can decompose. Some of the threats, oil and natural gas extraction are huge in the Arctic, and as the Arctic thaws, the oil and gas industry sees it as an opportunity to drill for more oil and gas, which is then going to be burned to release greenhouse gases, which is just going to accelerate global climate change. Um, peat and sphagnum moss mining, we'll talk about that on another PowerPoint, the wetland PowerPoint. Habitat destruction, fragmentation, unsustainable grazing, hunting and trapping, and then climate change. The two things that are happening are very similar to those that are happening in the alpine tundra, except instead of tree line advancing up the mountain, it's advancing north. And then we also have the thawing permafrost. So the Arctic tundra, another large contiguous biome, but not as large as the boreal forest. What is not shown in this diagram is the Antarctic tundra. There's a little bit on the edges of Antarctica, not a lot. Don't really have to worry about it, but I thought I'd mention it. So in order to talk about this, I am going to cover the types of ice that we have on the planet. Um, Not something that's huge for the AP test or something that you really need to know for the course, but it's something that these are terms that I'm going to use and terms that I want you to be familiar with. So an ice sheet, this is a large expanse of perennial ice, meaning ice that does not melt year after year after year, that covers over 50,000 square kilometers. So that is a very, very, very large expanse of ice. Today on the planet, we have two ice sheets. We have the ice sheet on Greenland and the ice sheet on Antarctica. So basically, the entire interior of Antarctica is an ice sheet. There are ice fields. These are smaller, but they're still large expanses of perennial ice. So down here, I have a picture of some mountains in Alaska where we have ice fields. This is perennial ice. And all this ice that is between these mountains doesn't melt even in the summertime. This is when I took the picture during the summer, and it doesn't melt, and it's perennial ice. And they are often terminated by glaciers, or they often have glaciers that are at their margins. Okay, what is a glacier? A glacier is perennial ice that moves under its own weight. So it's basically like a river of ice. If we look at this glacier, it is flowing towards the sea downhill from this ice field that is the interior all around those mountains. Okay, so a glacier is moving ice, whereas an ice field and an ice sheet are more or less static. Ice shelves, these are large platforms of ice that are floating on the ocean and attached to mainland glaciers or mainland ice sheets, or sorry, yeah, mainland ice sheets or mainland glaciers. So this is the ice shelf, that section right there. It's floating on the ocean below it, and it's attached to the glacier on the continent or on the island or whatever on the land. Okay. An iceberg is a floating mass of ice. So you guys are probably all familiar with icebergs, but they are floating masses of ice. Many of them are breaking off of ice sheets, ice shelves, or glaciers, and they're floating and being carried out to sea. And then sea ice. This is frozen seawater that floats on the open ocean. So when we talk about the seasonal sea ice in the North Sea or the Arctic Ocean, we're talking about ice that freezes during the winter and then melts during the summer. Some of it is going to stick around year after year after year. Some of it's going to stick around for maybe a couple decades. But increasingly today, we're seeing that it forms during the winter and then melts during the summer. So it's just seawater that is frozen, as opposed to all the other ones which are land-based. Okay, now that we talked about the types of ice around the planet, um, the biome that they create is ice sheets and polar ice. The latitude is very high up to the poles above the Arctic Circle and into Arctic and Antarctic circles and into the poles. Although the glaciers can be distributed throughout the world's high mountains. The daylight hours, they're going to have, these are the extremes that we talked about when we talked about the seasons, where above the Arctic Circle, you're going to have 24 hours of darkness during the winter and 24 hours of sunlight during the summer. The temperature ranges from, like, it's just very, very, very cold, and precipitation is very low, but that precipitation that falls typically doesn't melt and just builds up as layer over layer over layer of snow that compacts down into ice. So you have the formation of these ice sheets, ice fields, etc. Now that's a little bit different today because of global climate change and they're starting to melt. And then you always had some seasonal sea ice that melted as well as the ice that melted at the terminus of the glacier where it exits out into the sea, or it would calve off into an iceberg that would then float out to the sea and move away from the poles and then melt in the warmer waters. And again, where we find these in the around the planet, the ice sheets are Greenland and Antarctica. We have those two ice sheets today. But then the red that you see here is the high mountain glaciers all around the world in those high mountains. Um, and then you would have the sea ice up around the Arctic Circle, but it's not showing that in this diagram. Net primary productivity is very low, even lower than deserts. There is some algal growth under the ice. There can be some algal growth on top of the ice. This pink or reddish color down here, though, that's an algae that's growing on this ice in Antarctica. Um, you can have some lichen, grasses, or mosses growing in the bare soil between the ices, but like once you're there, you're technically in the tundra, not in the ice sheet itself. You can have phytoplankton attached to and underneath the ice if that is sea ice or an ice shelf. But most of the consumers in these biomes are going to be feeding from the surrounding ocean. So think about the polar bears, the walrus, the penguins. They're all going out to the oceans to feed. There is low biodiversity, but the biodiversity that is there are very unique and tend to be very charismatic, meaning that people tend to like them because they're really cool animals like walrus and polar bear and penguins. And like I have here with these puffins, there are lots of migratory birds in the that utilize the ice shelves, the ice sheets, the ice fields, all of that stuff. Um, the ecosystem services, it contains about 2% of all the world's water. So it's a large store of water on Earth. As the water is melting due to global climate change, that water that is on land, on Antarctica, Greenland, the high mountains, does flow out into the ocean. And eventually, like all rivers are going to lead to the ocean, a lot of it just flows directly into the ocean and rises global sea levels. It's really important for thermohaline circulation, especially just south of Greenland, where the AMOC or the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation is. It cools the globe through the albedo effect, so it's one of the large ice sheets around the planet, and to a lesser extent, the smaller ice fields and glaciers are cooling the planet by reflecting sunlight back into space before it can be absorbed by the Earth's surface and turn into infrared or long wave radiation that the greenhouse gases can absorb. There are some other ecosystem services that are a little bit more minor, including fishing and other animals for food. But once you're in the fisheries, then you're out into the ocean and not the ice sheet, the ice shelf, or the sea ice. The big threat is climate change. This biome is changing faster than any other biome because the ice is melting. You can see that with the glaciers on the top right corner. A little bit less than 100 years worth of glacier loss, and then just a few decades worth of sea ice loss and the north or the Arctic Circle from these photos taken for, or sorry, these computer images generated by NASA. Temperatures are rising faster at the poles than anywhere else, about 3 times faster than the rest of the planet, and many glaciers have already completely melted. Right. We also have oil and gas development. Like I said, with the tundra, as the ice melts, the oil and gas industry sees that as an opportunity to drill for more oil and gas. Pollution, overfishing are also threats. And then the solutions for those threats, climate change, reducing CO2 emissions, and drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere, establishing parks and other protected areas, limiting pollution, etc. And then again, Antarctica is not represented in this diagram, but we do have the large ice sheet of Greenland that is shown on this diagram. And then finally, we have the riparian zone. So we're moving away from the poles and we're going everywhere in the world that there is a river. The riparian zone is just that area next to the river that is different than the areas around, like further away from the river. So in the image on the top right, we see this green belt of vegetation right next to the river, whereas it's probably like the middle of summer and all of this grass has already turned tan and pretty dry, but the area around the river, the riparian zone, is a lot more wet. A more extreme example is in our deserts, where we might have some lush green vegetation right next to the river, but the rest of the environment is pure desert. Okay, so the riparian area is just that zone next to the river that is watered by the water flowing through the river and seeping into the soil underneath the vegetation, and it supports lots of vegetation, where you might have trees growing in what is otherwise a sandy desert. Okay, often higher net primary productivity, higher biodiversity than the surrounding areas. And we see some diagrams that are showing that. The one that I want to highlight down here is with the floodplain, because the riparian zone often does include large parts of the floodplain. And during heavy rainfall or heavy times of snow melt, that floodplain will flood, and the riparian zone is part of that. All right, so that was a whole lot, an hour and a half for just one learning objective. I'm going to call it there rather than going through each one of these little bits, because this video is already long enough. Please let me know if you guys have any questions. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all in class.